Thanks for joining us and watching this video by the Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department. In this webinar, we'll be talking about the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, providing you with general information and giving you an update on some information that's changed. So our topic today, what is rent stabilization? The purpose of the Rent Stabilization Ordinance is to protect tenants from excessive rent increases, and at the same time, it allows landlords to benefit from their investment in their rental property. It stabilizes rent for renters. It also requires that landlords have just cause when evicting tenants. When tenants are not at fault for evictions, the ordinance requires landlords to pay relocation assistance. What properties are covered under the Rent Stabilization Ordinance? If a housing accommodation is offered for rent in the City of LA and the certificate of occupancy was issued on or before October 1st, 1978, then it's covered by the Rent Stabilization Ordinance. Since 2007, certain replacement units built after 2006 are also covered by the Rent Stabilization Ordinance. The RSO currently covers about 638,000 housing units on 118,000 properties. These units include condos, co-ops, rooming houses, mobile home parks, hotels, and motels. While the Rent Stabilization Ordinance certainly applies to a lot of properties, it does not apply to properties that have one detached single-family dwelling on a lot and certain affordable housing units that are exempt. RSO usually doesn't apply to dwelling units built after October 1st, 1978. The Rent Stabilization Ordinance does not apply to luxury units approved by HCIDLA, hotel and motel rooms occupied less than 30 days, and rental units in commercial buildings that have been converted and rented for the first time as residential units after October 1st, 1978. The Rent Stabilization Ordinance requires that all RSO units rented or offered for rent must be registered annually with HCIDLA. There are two annual rental unit registration fees that tenants and landlords share. One is a rent registration fee per unit. The other fee is for the Systematic Enforcement Program known as SCEP, and that ensures rental units throughout the city are well maintained. These two fees can be passed on to tenants as long as written notice is provided in advance. In the month of June only, for a 30-day notice in the month of May, landlords can recover 50% of the annual registration fee. On a monthly basis, the landlord can recover 100% of the annual SCEP fee. Under the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, there are two types of rent increases. Rent increases that don't require approval and rent increases that do. So first up, we'll talk about rent increases that don't require approval. Rent increases that don't require approval include these instances. If a tenant voluntarily moves out, is evicted for non-payment of rent or a lease violation, or the tenant is evicted because they failed to move out as part of an adopted tenant habitability plan, or due to a government agency's order to vacate, then the rent can be increased and set to market value. In these cases, the rent is decontrolled and does not require approval. If a condo is being rented and the tenant started living there before 1996, they're protected by the RSO. But once a pre-1996 tenant vacates, the owner can increase the rent without approval and set it to market value. Approval is not required when increasing rent based on the annual allowable rent increase. This amount is set annually based on the Consumer Price Index and may be added to both rent and the security deposit. The landlord also has the right to add on an additional amount for gas and/or electricity. These rates change annually, so it's a good idea, again, to check with the HCIDLA on the current rates. Since we mentioned security deposits, it's also important to know that security deposits can earn interest if a landlord holds the deposit for at least 1 year. In determining the interest rate, landlords may provide copies of bank statements and pay the actual rate of interest earned to the tenant. As in the previous slide, this rate changes annually, so be sure to check in with HCIDLA for the current rate. Under the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, landlords can increase rent without approval when an additional tenant moves in. Landlords can increase rent within 60 days of learning about the additional tenant. One caveat to this is that there is no increase for the first child added to the existing tenancy. The second type of rent increase is where approval from HCIDLA is required. There are 4 cost recovery programs where approval is required before increasing rent. The programs are Capital Improvement Program, Primary Renovation Program, Rehabilitation Work, and Just and Reasonable Rent Increases. And we'll be diving a little deeper into each of these. First up is the Capital Improvement Program. The Capital Improvement Program refers to when a landlord is planning to make improvements to the rental unit or the common areas, and the improvement will last 5 years or more. Examples of some of these improvements include roofing, carpeting, draperies, stuccoing to the outside of a building, air conditioning, security gates, swimming pool, sauna, or hot tub, and similar improvements. How does a landlord apply for a capital improvement rent increase? Within 12 months of completing the work, the landlord must apply and attach copies of all pertinent documentation. Then HCIDLA notifies the landlord and tenant of the amount and work approved. The Capital Improvement Program allows for a temporary monthly surcharge to be passed on to tenants. This surcharge allows landlords to recover 60% of the improvement costs. The Primary Renovation Program also requires approval before increasing rent. The Primary Renovation Program refers to renovations of major building systems or to abate exposure to hazardous materials. This type of work may result in tenants not being able to live in the unit on a temporary basis. Some examples of things that would fall under the Primary Renovation Program are plumbing, structural and electrical renovations, removing lead-based paint, and addressing asbestos. Under the Primary Renovation Program, an application with HCIDLA is required. This is similar to the Capital Improvement Program. And because renovations under the Primary Renovation Program may make the property temporarily uninhabitable, a tenant habitability plan is required before work begins. Once HCIDLA accepts the tenant habitability plan, the landlord must notify tenants about the work that'll be done and options available to the tenant. Landlords can apply for a permanent rent increase within 12 months after finishing the primary renovation work. At most, the landlord can raise a tenant's rent by 10% divided equally over 2 years if the landlord's application for a rent increase is approved. This increase is a permanent rent increase that raises the tenant's current rent base in addition to any regular yearly rent adjustment. The rehabilitation program also requires approval before increasing rent. The rehabilitation program consists of any work done in a unit or common area to comply with an order issued by HCIDLA, the LA Department of Building and Safety, the Fire Department, or the Health Department. The rehabilitation work could occur as a result of changes in the building, fire, or health codes since 1979, or to repair damages resulting from natural disasters, things like fire or an earthquake. Rehabilitation work that results in a rent increase requires an application with and approval from HCIDLA. HCIDLA will notify both the landlord and the tenant of the amount and work approved. Landlords can charge a temporary rent surcharge, the lesser of 10% of rent, or $75, until the full cost is recovered by the landlord. Landlords can fully recover approved costs over a 60-month period. The Just and Reasonable program is the final program that requires approval. The Just and Reasonable program is based on a review of a property's net operating income. Landlords may use this program when net operating income, adjusted for inflation in the current year, is less than net operating income in the base year. However, this does not include mortgage payments. When applying for this program, landlords must provide 2 years of financial information. Additionally, if a property owner's expenses completely exceed income in the current year, the owner may apply for a just and reasonable rent increase with just 1 year's financial information. Landlords must submit an application and receive approval from HCIDLA. HCIDLA will notify both the landlord and tenant of the amount approved. This would be a permanent rent increase. HCIDLA bases its financial analysis on the landlord's net operating income. This program requires a hearing and written notice to tenants. To review, the 4 programs that require approval before increasing rent are the Capital Improvement Program, Primary Renovation Program, Rehabilitation Work, and Just and Reasonable Rent Increases. A reduction of housing services previously provided is considered an illegal rent increase. Habitability issues that tenants or landlords have are handled through code enforcement. So what about evictions? The Rent Stabilization Ordinance includes 2 types of evictions: evictions where the tenant is at fault and evictions where the tenant is not at fault. Examples of evictions where the tenant is at fault include when a tenant does not pay rent, violates part of the lease, or is acting as a nuisance. So that's if the tenant is causing damage to the rental unit or common areas, or is severely interfering with the comfort and safety of other tenants. At-fault tenant evictions include instances where the tenant is allowing the rental unit to be used for illegal purposes, including drug activity and gang activity. Tenant at-fault evictions also include instances when tenants fail to renew their lease after a written request by the landlord to extend or renew for a similar duration with similar details. Tenants are also at fault if they deny the landlord access to the unit so the landlord can make repairs, improvements, or for inspections required by law. Tenants are at fault if the subtenant at the end of a lease is not approved by the landlord, and if tenants fail to relocate based on the tenant habitability plan. Tenant no-fault evictions include situations when the landlord needs the rental unit for occupancy by a resident manager, by his or herself, spouse, children, grandchildren, parents, or grandparents. When the landlord needs to demolish the rental unit or remove it permanently from rental housing use. Tenants are not at fault for evictions that arise because of a government order, housing and urban development foreclosure, or conversion to affordable housing. Under the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, it's important to note that a change in ownership is not basis for eviction or rent increase. Also under the Rent Stabilization Ordinance, landlords may only evict for a legal reason. For no-fault evictions, landlords must file a Landlord Declaration of Intent to Evict with HCIDLA. Evictions also require that tenants are given 30 to 60 days notice per the state law, and some evictions require 4 months to a year's notice. Landlords are required to provide relocation assistance for no-fault evictions. Relocation assistance amounts change annually. Take a look at the amounts here and know that you can also contact HCIDLA at 213-808-8888 to verify the current rate. Here's a list of relocation amounts for mom and pop properties. This applies to evictions for occupancy by the landlord, their spouse, child, grandparent, parent, or grandchild. Again, this amount is updated annually, so be sure to verify with HCIDLA. Whether you're a landlord or tenant, we want to be a resource for you. You're invited to free monthly workshops we hold on various topics of interest. Visit our website at hcidla.lacity.org for details. We're here to help you, so feel free to reach us in any of the following ways. Visit our website at hcidla.lacity.org. You can call us at 213-808-8888 or visit us in person at one of our HCIDLA offices. You can also sign up for our electronic newsletter, hcidla.lacity.org/LAHD newsletter. To RSVP for workshops, go to hcidla.lacity.org/RSO workshops or give us a call at 213-928-9075. Thanks for tuning in to this webinar.